I watched a billionaire destroy someone's career with just 3 words. No explanation. No justification. Just 3 words that made a grown man beg. What she said next changed everything I thought I knew about power. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I don't owe you an explanation." That single sentence cost her nothing but made the man lose sleep for weeks. Made him lose himself, his worth, and how he sees himself. The man who got destroyed was actually in the right. He had valid reasons, solid logic, perfect justification for his actions. But the moment he started explaining himself, he handed over control. The billionaire just sat there, completely silent, watching this successful executive unravel himself with his own words. Here's what most people don't realize about that moment. The explanation wasn't clarity. It was submission. If you're someone who constantly feels the need to justify your decisions, explain your boundaries, or defend your choices, this video is going to hit you like a psychological sledgehammer. Because I'm about to show you why every time you explain yourself, you're actually weakening your position in ways you never imagined. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you handle every confrontation, every boundary violation, and every power dynamic for the rest of your life. The psychology behind this runs deeper than most people think. When someone demands an explanation from you, they're not seeking understanding. They're testing your resolve. They're probing for weakness. They want to see if they can make you dance to their rhythm. Think about the last time someone questioned your decision and you immediately started explaining. How did that feel? Did they suddenly respect your choice? Or did they find new angles to attack? Here's what actually happened in that moment. You showed them that their opinion mattered enough to make you stop what you were doing and justify yourself. You demonstrated that they had psychological leverage over you. You proved that you needed their approval. But what if I told you there was a response that would have completely flipped that dynamic? A response so psychologically powerful that it would have made them the uncomfortable one. The response is strategic silence. Let me tell you about Anna, a marketing director who discovered this principle the hard way. She was constantly explaining herself to her team, her boss, even her subordinates. Every decision came with a dissertation. Every boundary came with an apology. Then something happened that changed everything. Her toxic colleague Michael started undermining her in meetings. When she confronted him privately, he demanded to know why she was being so sensitive. Old Anna would have spent 20 minutes explaining her perspective, trying to make him understand her feelings. New Anna said 4 words, "That's not your concern." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face went through 5 different expressions. He tried to push harder, demanded a real explanation, even accused her of being unprofessional. Anna just looked at him and walked away. What happened next shocked everyone in the office. Michael stopped his undermining behavior entirely. Not because he suddenly respected her, but because he realized he couldn't manipulate someone who refused to play his game. But here's where it gets really interesting. Anna's boss started treating her differently too. With more respect. More authority. Because when you stop explaining yourself constantly, people start assuming you must have good reasons for your decisions. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you saw a truly powerful person explain themselves? I mean really explain, justify, and defend their choices to someone who questioned them? You haven't. Because power doesn't explain itself. Think about this for a second. When a judge makes a ruling, do they stand there explaining why they're not being unfair? When a CEO makes a strategic decision, do they call every employee to justify their reasoning? When a parent sets a boundary, do they negotiate with a 5-year-old about why bedtime exists? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human psychology. The person who explains is always in the inferior position. The person who demands explanations is always testing for control. This is where most people get it wrong. They think explanation equals respect. They believe that if they just make their reasoning clear enough, people will understand and back off. But that's not how power dynamics actually work. Let me break down what really happens when you explain yourself. First, you're acknowledging that the other person has the right to judge your decisions. Second, you're providing them with ammunition to argue against you. Third, you're showing them exactly what triggers you and how to push your buttons in the future. Every detail you give is data they can use against you. I learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. I had a friend who constantly questioned my choices. Where I was going, who I was seeing, why I made certain decisions. And like an idiot, I kept explaining myself, thinking I was being a good friend by keeping him informed. What I didn't realize was that he was mapping my psychology. Learning my insecurities. Understanding exactly how to make me doubt myself. Then one day, I just stopped. When he asked why I was acting different, I said, "I'm not acting different." When he pushed harder, I said, "You're free to see it that way." The relationship changed overnight. Not because I was being mean, but because I was no longer available for psychological manipulation. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds cold. This sounds like you're being difficult or antisocial. But here's what's actually happening when you refuse to over-explain. You're forcing people to respect your boundaries instead of negotiating with them. Comment below if you've ever found yourself trapped in endless explanations with someone who just wouldn't accept your answer. Because what I'm about to show you next will give you the exact words to end those conversations permanently. There's a phrase that changed everything for me. I don't feel the need to explain that. Not rude. Not aggressive. Just a clear statement that the conversation is over. But the psychology behind why this works is fascinating. When you refuse to explain, you create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance in the other person. They expected you to justify yourself, to give them something to work with, to provide them with an entry point for manipulation. Instead, you gave them nothing. And that nothing creates psychological pressure that most people can't handle. They start filling in the blanks themselves. They start imagining reasons. They start projecting their own insecurities onto your silence. And in that mental chaos, they reveal far more about themselves than you ever would have by explaining. This is where it gets really powerful. Your silence becomes a mirror that shows them exactly who they are. The manipulative person reveals their manipulation tactics when they can't get information out of you. The insecure person reveals their insecurity when they can't make you doubt yourself. The controlling person reveals their need for control when they can't get you to submit. Let me tell you about David, a guy I know who mastered this principle. His ex-girlfriend kept texting him, demanding to know why he ended things, why he wasn't responding to her calls, why he seemed so cold. Old David would have written paragraphs explaining his feelings, trying to make her understand, attempting to part on good terms. New David sent one text, "I've said what I needed to say." She sent 17 more messages. Each one more desperate than the last. Each one revealing exactly why the relationship needed to end. All because he refused to give her the explanation she felt entitled to. That's the key word, entitled. Most people feel entitled to your reasoning. They believe that if your decision affects them in any way, you owe them a detailed explanation of your thought process. But you don't owe anyone access to your mind. Think about the most confident person you know. How often do they explain themselves? How often do they justify their choices to people who question them? How often do they apologize for decisions they made with full intention? Probably never. And that's not because they're arrogant. It's because they understand something most people don't. Explanation is a form of permission seeking. Every time you explain yourself, you're subconsciously asking for approval. You're saying, "Please don't judge me too harshly for this choice I made." But confident people don't seek permission for decisions they've already made. Here's where most people mess this up. They think refusing to explain means being rude or dismissive. But there's a huge difference between being strategic with your words and being unnecessarily harsh. You can acknowledge someone's question without feeding their need for control. You can be polite without being submissive. You can maintain your boundaries without being cruel. The key is in your tone and your follow-through. When someone demands an explanation, you can simply say, "I understand you'd like more information, but I'm comfortable with my decision." That's it. No emotion. No defensiveness. No negotiation. What happens next will tell you everything you need to know about that person's character. Do they respect your boundary? Do they push harder? Do they try to guilt you into explaining? Do they get aggressive or manipulative? Their response becomes a personality test that you didn't even have to administer. Let me share something that might make you uncomfortable. Most of the people who demand constant explanations from you aren't actually confused about your decisions. They're testing to see if they can control you. Think about it. How often does someone accept your explanation and immediately drop the subject? How often do they say, "Oh, that makes perfect sense, thanks for clarifying"? Almost never. Because they weren't seeking understanding. They were seeking leverage. They want to find holes in your logic. They want to present counter-arguments. They want to make you doubt yourself. They want to prove that their way is better. They want to maintain psychological control over your decision-making process. And every time you explain yourself, you're giving them exactly what they want. This is why successful leaders, powerful negotiators, and confident individuals have one thing in common. They make decisions and move forward without constantly justifying themselves to every person who questions their judgment. Now, let me give you some tactical responses that will immediately shift any power dynamic in your favor. These aren't mean or aggressive. They're just psychologically sophisticated. When someone asks why you made a certain choice, instead of explaining, try, "It felt like the right decision for me." When someone demands to know your reasoning, try, "I'm comfortable with what I chose." When someone won't accept your boundary, try, "I understand you feel differently about it." Notice how none of these responses give them ammunition to argue with you. They acknowledge the person without submitting to their need for control. But here's the advanced level technique that will completely change your life. When someone really pushes for an explanation, turn the question back on them. Why is it important for you to understand my reasoning? What would change if I explained my decision to you? How would knowing my thought process help you? Suddenly, they're the ones who need to explain themselves. They're the ones who look unreasonable for demanding access to your private thoughts. The dynamic has completely flipped, and you didn't have to raise your voice or be confrontational to make it happen. If you're getting value from this, make sure you're subscribed because I'm about to reveal the most powerful psychological principle that makes this strategy practically unstoppable. Here's what most people don't realize about silence. It's not empty space. It's psychological pressure. When you refuse to fill the silence with explanations, you force the other person to sit in discomfort. And discomfort reveals truth. Watch what happens when you stay quiet after someone demands an explanation. They'll start talking to fill the void. They'll reveal their real motivations. They'll show you exactly what this is actually about. Most of the time, it has nothing to do with understanding your decision and everything to do with their need to feel in control of you. I remember watching a negotiation where one person kept asking the other to explain their offer. The smart negotiator just stayed quiet. The desperate one kept talking, revealing their bottom line, their timeline, their pressure points, all because they couldn't handle the silence. Silence makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to confront their own thoughts. When you're not giving them your reasoning to analyze, they have to analyze themselves. And most people don't like what they find when they look inward. This is why strategic silence is so powerful. It's like holding up a mirror to someone's psychology. Let me tell you about the most extreme example I've ever witnessed. A woman named Jessica worked with someone who constantly questioned her judgment, demanded explanations for every decision, and tried to micromanage her approach to everything. Instead of explaining herself for the 100th time, Jessica tried something different. When her colleague asked why she chose a particular strategy, Jessica just looked at her and said nothing. For 30 seconds. The colleague started talking faster, getting more agitated, revealing her insecurities, her need for control, her frustration with not being in charge. All because Jessica refused to fill the silence with justification. By the end of that conversation, the colleague never questioned Jessica's judgment again. Not because she suddenly agreed with Jessica's methods, but because she realized that Jessica was not available for psychological manipulation. That's the power of strategic silence. It doesn't just end the immediate conversation. It permanently changes the dynamic between you and that person. But here's where most people struggle with this concept. They're afraid of being misunderstood. They're terrified that people will think they're arrogant, cold, or unreasonable. Let me ask you something. How much energy are you currently spending trying to manage other people's opinions of you? How much time do you waste explaining yourself to people who are never going to be satisfied with your answers anyway? What if I told you that the people worth keeping in your life will respect your boundaries without demanding constant explanations? And the people who need you to justify every decision probably aren't adding much value to your life anyway. This is the brutal truth about relationships. The people who truly respect you don't need you to explain yourself constantly. They trust your judgment. They assume you have good reasons for your choices. They give you the benefit of the doubt. The people who demand constant explanations are usually the ones trying to maintain some form of control over you. Now, I'm not saying you should never explain anything to anyone. Communication is important in healthy relationships. But there's a massive difference between choosing to share your reasoning and feeling obligated to justify every decision you make. The key is recognizing when someone is asking for information versus when they're testing your boundaries. Here's how you can tell the difference. People who genuinely want to understand will accept your explanation and move on. People who are testing your boundaries will find problems with every explanation you give. If you find yourself in endless loops of explanation and counter-argument with someone, you're not dealing with confusion. You're dealing with a power struggle. And in power struggles, the person who explains first usually loses. Let me give you a framework for deciding when to explain and when to stay silent. Ask yourself these questions. Is this person someone whose opinion actually matters in my life? Are they asking from a place of genuine curiosity or from a need to control? Will explaining actually resolve anything, or will it just give them more ammunition? If the answers point toward control rather than genuine interest, then your explanation won't help anyway. Comment below if you can think of someone in your life who fits this pattern. Someone who never seems satisfied with your explanations and always finds new things to question. Here's what's really happening in those interactions. They're not trying to understand you. They're trying to wear you down. They're hoping that if they question you enough, you'll eventually just do what they want to avoid the confrontation. It's psychological warfare disguised as conversation. And the moment you recognize this pattern, you can step out of it entirely. You don't have to play their game. You don't have to justify yourself to someone who's not genuinely trying to understand. You can simply say, "I've made my decision," and walk away. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it immediately separates the people who respect you from the people who are just trying to manipulate you. The manipulators will get frustrated and probably distance themselves from you. Good. That's not a loss. That's a win. The people who genuinely care about you will respect your boundaries and trust your judgment, even when they don't fully understand your reasoning. Now, let me address the biggest objection people have to this strategy. But what if I'm wrong? What if my decision was actually bad and I should listen to their feedback? Here's the thing. You can still change your mind about decisions without explaining yourself to people who demand justification. You can still be open to feedback without submitting to psychological manipulation. The difference is choice versus pressure. When you choose to reconsider a decision based on new information, that's wisdom. When you change your decision because someone pressured you into explaining yourself until you doubted your own judgment, that's manipulation. You can tell the difference by how the conversation feels. Does it feel like collaborative problem solving, or does it feel like an interrogation? Let me share the most powerful realization I had about this whole concept. The people who respect your boundaries without explanation are the people worth keeping around. The people who demand constant justification for your choices are revealing something important about their character. They don't actually trust your judgment. They don't respect your autonomy. They believe they have the right to approve or disapprove of your decisions. And once you see that pattern, you can't unseen it. This doesn't mean you become cold or uncommunicative. It means you become selective about who gets access to your reasoning and who has earned the right to question your judgment. Your real friends, your family members who respect you, your colleagues who value your expertise, they don't need constant explanations because they trust you. The people who do need constant explanations are usually the ones you should be most careful around. Here's a practical exercise that will change how you see these interactions. For the next week, pay attention to who asks you to explain yourself and how they respond to your explanations. Do they accept your reasoning and drop the subject? Do they ask follow-up questions that seem genuinely curious? Or do they poke holes in your logic, present counter-arguments, and generally make you feel like you need to defend your choices? The second group is showing you exactly who they are. They're not seeking understanding. They're seeking control. And now that you know the difference, you can respond accordingly. When someone from the second group asks you to explain yourself, you can simply say, "I'm comfortable with my choice," and refuse to engage in the debate they're trying to start. Watch what happens. They'll probably get frustrated. They might accuse you of being stubborn or unreasonable. They might try harder to pull you into an argument. All of this is just confirmation that you made the right choice by not explaining yourself. Because here's what confident people understand that insecure people don't. You don't owe anyone access to your thought process. Your decisions don't require anyone else's approval. Your boundaries are not up for negotiation. The moment you truly internalize this principle, every relationship in your life will change. Some for the better, some for the worse. But all for the more authentic. The people who are trying to control you will either respect your new boundaries or remove themselves from your life. Either way, you win. The people who genuinely care about you will appreciate your newfound confidence and self-respect. And you'll discover something amazing. When you stop explaining yourself constantly, people start respecting your decisions more, not less. Because confidence is magnetic, and nothing communicates confidence like someone who doesn't need to justify their choices to every person who questions them. If this video has opened your eyes to some patterns in your own life, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what surprised you most about the psychology behind explanation and control. Remember, you don't owe anyone an explanation for becoming the person you were meant to be. You don't need to justify your growth to people who preferred you when you were smaller. And you certainly don't need to explain yourself to people who never intended to understand you in the first place. The most powerful response you can give to someone who demands an explanation you don't want to give is the one that requires the fewest words and the most self-respect. Sometimes that response is silence. Sometimes it's a simple statement of your position. But it's never a lengthy justification to someone who's already decided they disagree with you. Your energy is too valuable to waste on people who don't respect your judgment. Your time is too precious to spend convincing people who aren't genuinely interested in understanding. Save your explanations for the people who've earned them. For everyone else, your actions will speak louder than any words you could offer. And when you master this principle, you'll discover something that will change your life forever. The less you explain yourself, the more people listen when you do speak. That's the paradox of psychological power. The less available you make yourself for manipulation, the more influence you actually have. So stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand. Start surrounding yourself with people who respect your judgment. And watch how quickly your entire life transforms when you refuse to submit to other people's need for control. Because at the end of the day, the people who matter don't need constant explanations. And the people who need constant explanations probably don't matter as much as you think they do. That's the uncomfortable truth that will set you free from the exhausting cycle of over-explanation and underappreciation. Your decisions are yours to make. Your boundaries are yours to set. Your reasoning is yours to keep private. And anyone who has a problem with that is revealing far more about themselves than they are about you.